I left town for 2 weeks and came back to a house I couldn't drive into. That's not a metaphor. I mean, physically, literally, my driveway was gone. In its place was a picture-perfect brick courtyard leading straight into my neighbor's brand-new mansion addition, like my property had simply volunteered to join his estate while I was gone. I remember just sitting in my car at the curb, engine running, staring at it, trying to convince myself I had pulled up to the wrong house. But there was my mailbox, slightly crooked the way it's always been. There was the big maple tree my dad planted when I was 10, and there was a glossy fan of imported bricks spreading across what used to be 40 years of packed gravel that led to my garage. My neighbor, for context, was a guy named Grant Holloway. Mid-50s, hedge fund money, custom suits even on weekends, the kind of man who says, "My people will handle it," without irony. 3 years ago, he bought the old Whitaker estate next door and turned it into something out of Architectural Digest. Every month, there was a new crew, a new delivery, a new layer of excess. Wine cellar, glass elevator, guest house for visitors who probably already owned houses bigger than mine. The latest obsession had been what he called a European motor court, a grand circular entrance to display his collection of cars like they were museum pieces. Apparently, my driveway had been in the way of his vision. I killed the engine and stepped out, gravel crunching under my shoes until it didn't, because there was no gravel anymore, just brick. My garage sat there behind the courtyard like an afterthought, sealed off by someone else's landscaping. A low stone wall curved where my turning space used to be. Decorative lanterns lined the path. It was beautiful, I'll give him that. It was also mine. Grant was standing near the front of the courtyard with a tall guy in round glasses who I assumed was the architect. They were both admiring the symmetry like proud parents. I walked across the brick, feeling like I was trespassing on my own land. "Grant," I said, louder than I meant to. He glanced over, mild surprise on his face, like he'd just noticed a waiter hovering nearby. "Oh hey, you're back," he said. "How was the trip?" I didn't answer. I just pointed behind me. "Where's my driveway?" He followed my hand, as if he truly needed help locating it. Then he smiled, small and patronizing. "Oh, that old gravel strip? We had a survey done. Turns out it was never legally recorded as a dedicated driveway. It was more of an informal access path. My attorney said it's technically part of a shared easement area, so we upgraded it." "You're welcome. You're welcome." I actually laughed, because sometimes when something is so absurd your brain refuses to process it as anger. "You paved over my property while I was out of town." He shook his head. "We paved over an unregistered access corridor that overlaps my parcel. The new design benefits both of us. You now have a much more attractive entrance. It leads to your front door. It's shared," he said, like that solved everything. Here's the thing. This wasn't out of nowhere. Over the past year, his landscapers had pushed hedges 3 feet into my yard. His contractors parked on my gravel without asking. Every time I brought it up, I kept it polite, because that's who I am. I'm not a confrontational guy. I teach high school history. I believe in talking things through. And every time, Grant would nod, say something about miscommunication, promise to correct it. Nothing ever changed. But this crossed a line I didn't know how to uncross. "I can't get into my garage," I said. "My car's in the street." "You can drive across the courtyard," he replied. "Just be careful of the pavers. They're imported." I stared at him. "So I need permission to access my own house." "No one's asking you for permission," he said, that smooth Wall Street tone slipping in. "But we do have documentation supporting the modification. If you have concerns, you're free to review it." The architect shifted awkwardly. I could tell even he knew this looked bad. I went inside my house through the front door because I couldn't pull around back, and I did what any normal person does in 2026 when something feels wrong. I called the county planning office. The woman on the phone sounded tired before I even explained. "Oh yes," she said. "We've received filings regarding an easement clarification on your street. Mr. Holloway's legal team submitted quite a bit of documentation. It will take several weeks to review." "Several weeks?" I said. "I can't access my garage." She paused. "You may want to consult an attorney." Which is bureaucratic code for, "Good luck." That night I sat at my kitchen table, staring at old photos of this house. My grandfather built it in 1958 when this hillside was just dirt roads and ambition. He was one of the original developers, not a rich man, just stubborn and practical. He believed in wide setbacks, shared green space, and making sure emergency vehicles could get anywhere they needed to go. I grew up hearing stories about how carefully he mapped everything out. And as I sat there, something tugged at me. Because my grandfather kept everything. Every plat map, every early subdivision sketch, every handshake agreement that later turned into paperwork. When he passed, my mom boxed up his files and stuck them in the attic. I hadn't looked at them in years. Around midnight, I climbed the attic ladder with a flashlight and started digging through dusty banker's boxes labeled in his careful handwriting. Cedar Ridge Phase 1. Utility agreements. Access routes. And somewhere between a yellowed blueprint and an old Polaroid of my grandfather standing beside a bulldozer, I found something that made my stomach flip. Grant had hired expensive lawyers, but he hadn't known my grandfather. What I found in that attic wasn't dramatic at first glance. It wasn't some bold red stamp that said gotcha or a deed with my name etched in gold. It was boring, technical, the kind of paperwork most people skim and file away forever, which is exactly why Grant's team missed it. There were original subdivision plats from 1957, hand-drawn in ink, with my grandfather's initials in the corner. There were recorded utility easement agreements with the county seal, detailing a main service corridor running along the back edge of what is now Grant's expanded courtyard. Water mains, natural gas lines, primary electrical conduit. Not just lines servicing my house, but half the neighborhood uphill. And then there was a separate document labeled Secondary Emergency Access Route, Cedar Ridge. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor reading it twice. The so-called informal gravel strip that Grant had paved over wasn't informal at all. It was designated as a secondary emergency access lane for fire and medical vehicles in case the main road became blocked. It was intentionally left uncurbed, unadorned, and wide enough for a ladder truck to maneuver. The language was clear. Permanent access. Not to be obstructed. Not to be modified without municipal approval and coordination with utility providers. Grant's courtyard sat directly on top of it. I remember just laughing quietly to myself up there in the dust. Not out of cruelty, not yet, but out of that strange relief when you realize you're not crazy. That gut feeling you had wasn't paranoia. It was history. The next morning, I skipped grading papers and turned my dining room table into a war room. I scanned everything. I highlighted clauses. I compared the old plat maps to the satellite image of Grant's renovation that I pulled up online. The brick pattern of his new motor court overlapped the exact coordinates of the utility corridor. Then I walked the courtyard slowly with my phone in my hand. If you looked closely, you could still see faint spray paint marks near the edge of the stone wall, utility markers that had been half scrubbed off. A small metal cap that used to mark a gas shutoff was now embedded awkwardly between two pavers. Decorative planters had been placed directly over what my grandfather's map labeled as transformer vault access. Grant might have money, but he had bulldozed over infrastructure he didn't understand. I called the utility company first. The woman who answered sounded skeptical until I mentioned recorded easements and gave her the parcel number. There was a long pause while she typed. "Sir," she said slowly, "that corridor is classified as critical access. Any permanent surface modification would require coordination with us." "Well," I said, looking out the window at imported Italian brick, "you might want to come take a look." Next, I called the fire department non-emergency line. I explained that the designated secondary access lane on Cedar Ridge appeared to be obstructed. The captain on duty asked a few pointed questions. When I mentioned that a private renovation had replaced the gravel path with a raised courtyard and landscaping features, his tone shifted from polite to interested. "Send me the documentation," he said. "All of it." By Friday afternoon, I had emailed a stack of scanned records to 3 separate offices. Then I waited. Grant, meanwhile, acted like nothing was wrong. He hosted what I assume was some kind of wine tasting that weekend. I could hear laughter and clinking glasses from my backyard. Luxury cars rolled across the courtyard, carefully, like it was a showroom floor. At one point he saw me standing near my fence and raised a glass in my direction. "You getting used to the upgrade?" he called. I walked closer, leaning against the fence. "You ever check what's under those bricks?" I asked. He smiled, indulgent. "Professionals handled everything." "I'm sure they did." He took a sip. "You know, this doesn't have to be adversarial. We could formalize a shared access agreement. Increase your property value. I'm trying to elevate the neighborhood." There it was. That word. Elevate. What he meant was control. Cedar Ridge used to be modest. Teachers, contractors, retirees. Since Grant moved in, property taxes rose, expectations shifted. There had even been quiet talk at HOA meetings about modernizing standards, which usually meant aligning with whatever aesthetic he preferred. He wasn't just building a motor court. He was reshaping the identity of the block. "I don't need elevating," I said. "I need my driveway." He sighed, like I was the difficult one. "We'll let the county sort it out." Oh, they would. Monday morning at 8:12, the first truck arrived. It wasn't subtle. A white utility vehicle with the company logo on the side pulled up right in front of Grant's gate. Two more followed. Then a city planning SUV. Then, about 15 minutes later, a fire department pickup. I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee I wasn't drinking. Grant came out in workout clothes, AirPods in, probably heading for a run. He slowed when he saw the trucks. One of the utility supervisors, a stocky woman with a clipboard, walked straight to the center of the courtyard and began pacing, comparing the physical layout to a printed map. Grant approached her with that same polished confidence. "Can I help you?" he asked. She didn't smile. "Are you Mr. Holloway?" "Yes. We've received notice of potential obstruction of a primary utility easement. We need to inspect subsurface access points." He blinked. "There's no obstruction. This area was cleared through proper channels." She looked down at her paperwork. "Our records show no coordination request for surface hardscaping over this corridor." The fire captain joined them, nodding at me briefly across the way. Grant noticed. "You called them?" he asked, turning toward my yard. "I sent documentation," I said. "They decided to show up." For the first time since I'd met him, his composure cracked just slightly. "This is unnecessary," he said to the group. "My legal team confirmed my rights." The city planner, a thin man with reading glasses, flipped open a folder. "Your renovation permits do not reference utility encroachment mitigation, nor do they address the designated secondary emergency access lane." Grant's jaw tightened. "Secondary what?" The fire captain stepped forward. "This gravel strip," he said, pointing to the courtyard, "was mapped as an emergency access route for apparatus deployment. It appears to be narrowed and obstructed." "It's brick?" Grant said, like that was the solution. "It's landscaped," the captain replied, "and it includes fixed features that impede turning radius." Silence hung there, thick and electric. The utility supervisor crouched near one of the planters and tapped it with her boot. "We need this removed to access the gas shutoff beneath." Grant looked around at his courtyard, at the cars parked in neat symmetry, at the stonework he'd probably spent months designing. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you're going to tear up my property?" The supervisor met his eyes. "If it sits on our easement and blocks access, yes." I didn't feel triumphant in that moment. I felt something quieter. Validation. The kind that settles deep in your chest. Grant's world operated on influence, on paperwork and leverage. Mine operated on patience and archives. And under those beautiful bricks ran pipes and wires that didn't care about hedge funds. What happened next didn't explode all at once. It unfolded, methodical and clinical, which somehow made it more brutal. The utility crew came back the following morning with orange cones and ground-penetrating radar equipment. By noon, they had spray-painted bright lines across Grant's pristine courtyard, neon marks slicing through imported brick like a crime scene diagram. Neighbors gathered in small clusters along the sidewalks, pretending to walk their dogs a little longer than usual. Grant stood near his front steps with his phone pressed to his ear, pacing. "I don't care what it costs," I heard him say at one point. "Just fix it." But this wasn't a quick fix. The radar confirmed multiple critical lines directly beneath the courtyard, including a transformer vault that required unobstructed vertical access. The gas company flagged the embedded shutoff. The water authority identified a main that serviced not just our street, but the cul-de-sac above us. The fire department measured turning radii and determined that the stone wall and decorative pillars narrowed the emergency lane below code. By Wednesday, the city issued a formal notice of violation. Immediate remediation required. At the owner's expense. Grant's legal team tried to slow it down. I saw two different men in suits come and go, carrying thick binders, gesturing emphatically at site maps. But every time they argued technicalities, the agencies pointed to recorded easements older than Grant's entire investment portfolio. Permanent access. Non-obstructable. The phrase came up again and again. The first jackhammer hit the courtyard Friday at 7:03 a.m. It echoed through the neighborhood like thunder. I was at my kitchen sink when it started, and I won't lie, I just stood there for a moment and listened. Not smiling, not gloating, just absorbing the sound of inevitability. Chunk by chunk, the bricks came up. Planters were lifted out. The low stone wall was dismantled. Underneath the polished surface was exactly what my grandfather had mapped almost 70 years ago: steel lids, conduit, valves, infrastructure humming quietly all along. Grant tried one last angle. He came over while the crew was cutting a rectangular section out of the center of the courtyard. "This didn't have to go this far," he said, voice tight but controlled. I set down the rake I'd been holding. "You paved over my access while I was out of town," I said. "What did you think would happen?" "I thought we could modernize the layout, increase values, make this street something more than it is." "There it is again," I said. "Something more." He exhaled sharply. "You're holding on to nostalgia. The world changes." "Sure," I said, "but easements don't." For a second, we just stood there with the sound of machinery filling the space between us. "You could have come to me," he said finally. "I did," I replied. "Every time your people crossed the line." He didn't answer that. The remediation process took weeks. Utilities had to be inspected, reinforced in some areas where construction had stressed them. The city required the full emergency lane to be restored to proper width and load-bearing specifications. Ironically, the final design looked a lot like what had been there before: simple, functional, unpretentious. Grant's insurance company denied coverage on the demolition and reconstruction. The language in the policy excluded knowingly unauthorized encroachments. I didn't see the paperwork myself, but I heard enough through neighbors who had friends in real estate to understand the number was significant. Between tearing out the courtyard, relocating certain surface features, repairing damaged lines, and re-permitting portions of the renovation, he was looking at well over $500,000. And that didn't include the sunk cost of what he'd built. One evening about a month into the chaos, I found him sitting alone on his front steps. No suit, no phone, just staring at the partially restored access lane, now gravel again, temporary but compliant. He looked smaller somehow. My architect said the survey was solid. He muttered, "Not really to me, but not to me either." "Surveys don't override history," I said gently. He gave a humorless laugh. "You win." I shook my head. This wasn't about winning. But maybe, in a quiet way, it was about boundaries. 6 months later, the house went on the market. The listing described it as a meticulously updated estate with re-engineered utility access and code-compliant emergency accommodations, which is real estate language for "we had a problem, and now we don't." It sold below what he paid plus renovations. Rumor had it, he took a substantial loss. The moving trucks came early one morning. I watched from my porch as furniture was wrapped and loaded. Grant didn't look at my house once. A new family moved in that fall. 2 parents, 3 kids, a golden retriever that immediately claimed the yard. They knocked on my door the first week with a pie and introduced themselves. The dad asked casually about the gravel access lane. Said he wanted to make sure he understood any restrictions before planning upgrades. I almost laughed. "It's there for a reason," I told him. "Trust me. These days my driveway is better than it used to be." As part of the city's remediation, they reinforced it to meet modern fire standards. It's still simple, still gravel, but it's solid, functional, honest. Sometimes I think about how close I came to just giving up, to letting paperwork and money steamroll me. It would have been easier, in the short term, to adapt, to share, to let the narrative become that the old teacher next door was resistant to progress. But this house carries my grandfather's fingerprints. Not literally, but in the way it was planned, in the intention behind the lines on those old maps. He believed communities work when people respect what's shared and what's not. Grant believed vision justified expansion. Maybe that's the real conflict. Not driveway versus courtyard, but philosophy versus ambition. I don't hate the man. I don't even think he saw himself as a villain. In his world, everything is negotiable. Everything can be optimized, improved, leveraged. He probably thought I'd fold, or settle, or be flattered by association. Instead, the pipes under his bricks reminded him that some systems existed long before he arrived. So here's what I'm curious about. If you were in my position, would you have handled it differently? Would you have pushed back the same way, or tried to compromise? Maybe let the shared entrance stand for the sake of peace? And if you were in his shoes, would you see this as overreach on my part or just the cost of moving too fast? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know where you land on it, because neighborhood conflicts aren't always black and white. They're personal, they're layered, and sometimes they're buried under brick until someone decides to dig. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever had someone cross a boundary and had to decide whether to stay quiet or stand your ground, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe if you want more real stories like this one. And drop your take below. Was this justice, karma, or just two stubborn men protecting what they believed was theirs? I'll see you in the comments.